Our next presenter is a guy that I have been so excited to bring to Spur Leadership for a long, long time. I had the privilege of meeting Sebastian Junger 2 years ago when he released his book, Tribe, on homecoming and belonging. Now, if you've ever seen the movie, The Perfect Storm, Sebastian wrote the book that became that movie. He's also an Oscar-nominated documentary director for his film Restrepo, which tells the story of a forward operating base in Afghanistan where he was embedded, and tells that story so powerfully and incredibly well. But when Sebastian was coming through Austin on his book tour for Tribe, I had read the book and was so moved by it and so helped by what he says in this book about our need for each other, our need for belonging, no matter what we do, no matter where we are, that I actually decided to go to a book signing. I've never gone to a book signing. I'm not like an author fanboy or anything like that, but I decided that I would go down to this book signing because it was so riveting. The way he tells the story of Tribe and human beings' need for each other and need for connectivity. And when we were there, I actually stood in line to get him to sign a copy of his book. And I was trying to think about what to say, because here I am, I'm a pastor in Texas. Sebastian is an incredibly prolific author and director. He lives in New York. He's an atheist, I'm a Christian, but I thought we still share this incredible bond in common that we believe in connectivity. And so as I was standing in line with him, I just said, hey, Sebastian, I just want to introduce myself. I'm a pastor here in town, but I cannot thank you enough for having written the book Tribe. And I know you're an atheist, but I'm a pastor, and I just want to tell you thank you, because what you've done helps me do what I do. And we actually did a sermon series called Tribe based on his book. And I'm telling you, he was so gracious. When I said that, he was like, wow. It's like he was surprised that a Christian was being nice to him, which is kind of not a good commentary, but he said, man, thank you so much. I really appreciate that. I said, have you ever spoken at a church? And he goes, all they'd have to do is ask. And I said, well, how do we get that ball rolling? He goes, well, I'll give you my email address. And that started an email conversation that is culminating today, but is not ending today. We are so excited to have joining us. And I want to ask you if you will join me in welcoming to the Spur Leadership stage, Sebastian Junger. Give it that way.
Thank you so much. So first of all, I've come down here this morning with a really gnarly New York City flu, all right? So I'm not shaking anybody's hands, because seriously, I think I could take out the whole congregation almost overnight. You're good people, I don't want to do that. But seriously, just to say, if I have a 30-second paroxysm of coughing, don't worry, I'll be fine. I'll be back. I'm just kind of sick. So the idea of leadership, I haven't talked much about that, but the title of this got me thinking about leadership, because of course, one of the things I'm known for is this work that I did with U.S. soldiers in Afghanistan, and good soldiers need good leaders. All soldiers need good leaders. And I did put some thought into what made the officers that were with the unit that I was with were incredibly good officers, really good leaders. And it was actually they that got me thinking about what's it mean to be a good leader. But I want to start that conversation by talking about my dad a bit. Yesterday was the 7-year anniversary of his death. He died at 89. He was a physicist and an atheist. I grew up without going to church at all. And he was born in Europe. He was a refugee of 2 wars. When he was a little kid, he and his parents, he and his family lived in Madrid. And when the fascists under Franco took over, they fled Madrid and to France. And his father was Jewish. And when the Nazis rolled into Paris some years later, my dad was, I think he was 18, something like that. they fled Paris, and he wound up in this country and eventually met my mother. So he wasn't religious, but he had a very clear idea of what it meant to be conducting a sort of sacred task. And for him, a sacred task was anyone who was engaged in helping people live better lives, right? And that obviously includes a lot of people in the ministry, right? It includes a lot of psychotherapists, teachers, artists, I think you could even say. Where would we be without artists, musicians, with all that whole part of the human sensibility? Imagine stripping that out of our society. It would feel like a dead society. Journalists help society live better. Democracy doesn't function without a functioning press. And so he had this idea of a sacred task, and what made it sacred was the fact that at the end of the day, you were engaged in helping people lead lives that they understood a little bit better, and that had dignity and meaning. And that issue of human dignity is incredibly important. I've thought a lot about it. Human dignity is important because we can understand the circumstances that we're living through. A tree doesn't have an inherent dignity because it doesn't have consciousness. And one of the very, very strange things that either the universe or God, and I really don't care which anyone thinks it is, it makes no difference at all. But one of the very strange things that the universe or God saw fit to produce was that essentially the mineral dust that we're all made of, we humans, that we're all made of, we're made of chemicals, we're made of minerals, right? That mineral dust was able to organize itself in such a way that it was self-animating, it could move itself around, that's already crazy, that it was self-reproducing, and that eventually, with us, it became self-contemplating. That's pretty mind-blowing, right? And once you're self-contemplating, you're now in the realm of dignity. I think one of the war crime, I can't remember, this goes a long way back in my journalism, but one of the principles of war crime law is outrages upon human dignity. It's a very, very important thing. And what my father felt was that if you were engaged in trying to shore up human dignity and trying to help people lead better lives, you really, on some level, had to put yourself last. If you put yourself first, if that's a sort of ego-driven endeavor, you may do a lot of good in the world, absolutely. But at the end of the day, if it's about you, you will fail that ultimate test, and that ultimate test of character and morality. And he used to tell me this story. It's an amazing story. So he grew up, said in Europe. He fled Paris, very heavy of heart when the Germans came in. Went to New York, got an amazing education, and watched the fascists take over the civilized, what he called the civilized world. Then he watched this country. He couldn't serve because he had asthma. He watched this country and England and the resistance in France start to roll it back. At an enormous cost, they reclaimed humanity, essentially. And one of the stories he used to tell was of Charles de Gaulle. Of course, when Paris was liberated, it was an incredibly important day for him. And back then, right when it was liberated, there was still a lot of nastiness going on. There were snipers. There was all kinds of stuff going on. You could still get killed in Paris after the Germans pulled out. And there was a huge rally in front of the Arc de Triomphe et d'Étoile. And Charles de Gaulle spoke on this platform. And sniper fire rang out. And everyone dropped to the ground. I mean, you don't ever have to have been under gunfire to drop to the ground when you hear gunfire aimed at you. It's amazing how completely instinctive that reaction is, right? Everyone drops to the ground, and he stands ramrod straight and just keeps talking. And he knew this was a critical time for his nation, for his people. He knew that if his nation saw him cringe, they were doomed. It was worth sacrificing his life to have the nation feel that they had a leader that was not thinking about his own safety. What a profound thing, right? That's leadership. That's upholding human dignity. That was what my father was always talking about. And sometimes I'm asked to give talks by companies, corporations, about, I wrote a book called Tribe, right? So about how to make the workplace more tribal, blah, blah, blah. And I have some good advice, I think, and I'm going to get to some of that material before my time is out. But what sometimes these corporate leaders will say is like, what's the best way to run a company? And look, you can run a company any way that maximizes profits and is ethical and does well in the, whatever. Whatever. I'm not a businessman. I don't know how to tell you to run a company. But I can tell you how to lead a company. And that I learned from being with American soldiers in Afghanistan. And what I realized was that the officers who were the most respected, and essentially they were all respected, I shouldn't even make that distinction, what they respected about these guys, and these guys were young, right? The soldiers were 19, the officers were 23, right? And they were old men already. The company captain was 26 years old. When I was 26, I was still waiting tables, and badly, right? I couldn't even do that very well. Captain Kearney was calling in airstrikes, and so what made these officers so respected was that they very clearly were not trying to protect themselves with their men. It was all men out there, the unit that I was with. At one point we were about to get hit pretty badly, and we were sort of on this ridge, and the enemy was on both sides of us. In other words, there was no cover. Whatever side of the ridge you were on, you were exposed. It was horrible. And the ICOM chatter was like, we got them, there's nowhere for them to run. We were waiting for it. And Lieutenant Piosa stood up to double check where his heavy machine guns were, his 240s, where they were positioned to counterattack when we got hit. And he stood up. Everyone's eating the dirt, right? He stood up. And a sergeant, Kevin Rice, said, "Sir, please sit down. My job," he said, "your job's to lead the men. My job is to take fire. We need you. Please sit down." And so that's leadership. And so what it means, I think, is that you are willing, in fact, you insist on experiencing the consequences of your decisions along with the people you lead. Now, you may have more responsibility, you may have more seniority. Do you benefit in an outsized way from the good things that happen? Yeah, that's how business works, right? Of course. But what you can't do to be a leader, a corporate leader, is shield yourself from bad outcomes. And what you see and this is where I think America has really sort of lost its way, right? What you see in corporate America, often companies will literally fire people while the leadership is taking, year-end bonuses. That's insane, right? In human terms, that's insane. That's not leadership. You're just running a company at that point. The recession in 2008, okay, it was around a dozen people, all men, I believe, that essentially triggered this cascade of economic consequences that resulted in the crash of '08. It put this country $14 trillion behind. $14 trillion, right? And as a result of the suicide rate and the unemployment rate are very, very closely connected for some tragic reasons. And the suicide rate shot up. Epidemiologists were able to use statistical methods to figure out that around 5,000 suicides were a direct result of the increase in the unemployment rate. 5,000 people died. Good people, Americans, us, right? It's around the number of people that have died in Iraq and Afghanistan, roughly. They're Americans too, right? And they killed themselves out of despair. And all of those people all those people that did that took huge year-end bonuses while the country was bailing out their companies that they'd ruined. It's craziness, right? So what I think we need to do as a society, and I get asked this question a lot, like how do we come back together, right? We're not going to make it apart, right? We're not. How do we bring this back together? I love differences of opinion. I think it's great that the left and the right argues. It's wonderful, right? That's how you get good policy, is through argument. I mean, any marriage works that way, right? Like, God forbid either side determine everything. Nightmare, right? But you argue it out, and you get somewhere in the middle that kind of works, right? And there's a wisdom in that. And so I feel that a healthy society is one where leaders heal fractures and create bonds. Humans evolved over millions of years in very small groups in a very hostile environment. Alone in nature, humans die. We die almost immediately. But in a group, not only do humans survive in the most outrageously hostile environments in the world, from the Gobi Desert to the Arctic, to the jungle, not only do we survive, we thrive. And we have created a society with rule of law and philosophy and art and music and ethics. And we understand how the universe was started to within, what, a billionth of a second or something insane like that. It's amazing what we are, right? But we do that because we're together. And likewise, a healthy society insists on selfless leadership. They go hand in hand. And I promise you, over the hundreds of thousands of years of human evolution, the thing that allowed us to progress and to thrive was that leaders understood that without their community, they were dead, and the community understood that without a good leader, they were dead. Everyone needed everybody. And so one of the interesting things that you see, if you put yourself in a situation of extreme danger, is people very, very quickly start to function like that. So I was out at this outpost called Restrepo. Maybe it was the size of this floor space right here, okay? Something like that. Around 20, 24 men. First 3 months, they didn't even have a generator out there. They just slept in the dirt. They didn't change their clothes for a month at a time, maybe. I mean, they were wearing stuff that was literally rotting off their bodies. MREs every day, and a huge amount of combat. I mean, the first day that I was at Restrepo, it was up in this ridge, right, this sort of knife-edge ridge above the company headquarters, and the enemy used to shoot from that spot down into the company headquarters, so they took it over. They took that position over. My first day out there, we were in 4 firefights, like not just a couple of pops, right? The real deal, right? Like there were guys coming up close to the wire. We were worried about hand grenades getting thrown into the position, stuff like that, right? I had a bullet impact the sandbag a couple of inches from my forehead. It was the first round of the first burst of the first firefight of the day. And sand was kicked into the side of my face. What I'm sure many of you know about gunfire is that the sound gets there long after the bullet does, right? So if someone's shooting at you, you don't hear, the first thing you hear is this odd sort of snapping sound. You don't hear the classic machine gun fire sound, right? That comes later. Later is a half a second later, but a half a second in that circumstance is a really long time, right? So I felt sand kicking to the side of my face. I just had time to think, what the hell was that? And then I heard the gunfire. I realized what it was. The guy was shooting from 500 meters, and he missed me by a couple of inches. What's the angle on that, right? If your understanding of the world is rooted in physics, what are the forces? What's the vector? What's the math on that? If you believe in God, what was that decision by God? You know, like terrifying. It's all. There were guys walking around out there with holes in their uniforms by bullets that had passed through the fabric and not touched them. Everyone had a story like that. And those guys were out there without, they had no internet, they had no communication with the outside world. nothing. And they were out there for a year plus on that hill, right? And when it came time to go home temporarily, home was Vicenza, Italy, where the 173rd is based. So I won't go into details, polite company, et cetera, but they had some pretty big plans for when they were going to hit town in Vicenza after the deployment. They were definitely psyched to hit Vicenza. And I caught them. I wasn't there when they got to Vicenza. I got there a couple months later. And by that point, the trauma reaction had settled in. Things were starting to get a little heavy. There were some very psychologically wounded young men walking around. One guy was like, I don't understand. I just keep crying all the time. He didn't get it. He was like, he said he wasn't even crying over specific things. He just would just start bawling randomly. And I knew what he was talking about because I was doing the same thing everybody was. And no one knew what it was about. But this is my point. A lot of those guys, they were going to get shipped back to America, right? And a lot of them were like, the truth is, we don't want to go back. We want to go back to Restrepo. We can't face America. And I really thought about that. It's such an odd, are they all so massively damaged that they, what? I didn't believe it. Like, what is it? I really wonder, what is it that they were going back to Restrepo for? Are they just addicted to firefights, right? But I thought about when I was a young man, I had this wonderful thing happen to me. I had a sort of mentor, a sort of uncle figure named Ellis Settle, and he was half Lakota Sioux, half Apache. He grew up out west. He was born in 1929. He was incredibly well-read, amazing man. I learned a lot from him. And at one point, and this was the way he said it, he said, all throughout the history of the frontier in this country, he said, the truth is, and this is the way he phrased it, he said, the truth is the white people were always running off to join the Indians. But we Indians, we never ran off to join the white people. And all of a sudden I thought about, he went on to point out the people that were captured in raids along the frontier and taken back to these tribal societies. And there's quite a famous case of a young woman that had that happen to her from right around here. There's a book called, I blanked on it, it's an amazing book. Anyway, it happened in Texas too. Even people that were kidnapped, when given the chance to be repatriated back to their family, their community, they often refused to go. So Ellis told me about that. I was never quite sure. I sort of liked the story. It sort of made a kind of sense, but I wasn't sure if I believed him. And then when these soldiers were telling me they didn't want to go back to America, I'm like, oh my God, Ellis, it's the same thing. What is going on? And I finally realized that what these guys had out there, they were sleeping shoulder to shoulder, 30 of them, 20 of them, depending on each other for their lives, doing everything together for a year, right? And then they're coming home to a society that, because of our enormous affluence, people have their own single-family homes. Affluence allows people to live in greater isolation from one another. If you don't have anything, or you're being attacked by people, you're bunking together, right? Sorry, that's how it works. And now, we live in a society that's so affluent, and I grew up like this. I grew up in a really affluent suburb of Boston, where nobody knew each other in all the houses. We didn't need to know each other, because if we needed some help on something, we called the contractor. If we had a leaky roof, we didn't need the neighbor to help. My dad just called the contractor. And that's the downside of affluence. And in our home, as in many homes, each child had their own bedroom. We were affluent enough for children, every child, to have their own bedroom. That's lovely, that's great. But it also is a first time in human history that we have not lived collectively. And there's a great liberation in that, and there's a great loss. So what we know is that sort of collectivity buffers people from psychological stress, right? As affluence goes up in a society, the suicide rate tends to go up. The depression rate tends to go up. PTSD rates go up with affluence. Anxiety rates go up. as society gets more affluent, people are more and more prone to these very real psychological disorders, and disorders that will kill some of them, right? And if you think about it, a platoon is around 30 or 40 people. That's, anthropologists would tell you that that's roughly the size of a typical proto-human band in our evolution. That humans, for most of our history, our prehistory, we survived in groups of 30, 40 people, maybe the number of people in this room, something like that. Small enough group that you kind of knew everybody, right? And so combat sort of reproduces what we are genetically wired to understand as community. These people need me, I need them. One way to make sure that you're part of the group is to be needed by them, right? Otherwise, if you're not needed by the group, then you're with them at their pleasure, right? If you are forced out of that group, you die. Humans don't survive by themselves. The group is everything. And a way to make sure that even if people don't like you, you're part of that group is to be needed. Now think about what happens emotionally, psychologically, when people retire, when people lose their jobs, when people come back from war and can't get a job, or have a disability that and this is such a double-edged sword, a disability that allows them a disability check that's just sufficient for them to not have to work. All of a sudden, their society does not need them. They go from an experience of being intensely needed by all the people in that group that they love. And trust me, you can love someone you don't like. That's really easy. That's an easy one. They happen all the time out there. They go from that to a situation where they're not needed and they're not even sure how they can volunteer a contribution. We're good. We're going to retire you at 65. We're fine. That's psychologically devastating to people, and you see the suicide rate shoot up in retirees and in people that lose their jobs. So one of the interesting things about this is that if you collapse modern society, what you see is that people very quickly find these sort of ancient communal behaviors. So the Blitz in London, for example, for 6 straight months, the German Air Force bombed London and other German cities. They were bombing civilians. They were not bombing hardened soldiers, right? They were bombing men, women, children, old people, everybody. And they killed 30,000 civilians in 6 months. We lost 3,000 in 9/11. We're still traumatized by it. 30,000 people, right? So the government, the British government, was worried that there was going to be mass psychiatric casualties from these bombings. Of course, bombs are screaming down on a civilian population. So, but what happened? Admissions to psych wards went down during the Blitz, went down, and then went back up when the Blitz stopped. When there's an emergency, when people are in danger, when your people are in danger, what seems to happen is this collective impulse towards community, towards helping other people. And if you're helping someone else, you're not thinking about your own problems. I mean, one British official said that, in amazement, he said that there were what he called the chronic neurotics of peacetime. Now, we all know people like that, right? God bless them, but they're out there. We have the chronic neurotics of peacetime driving ambulances. The urgency of the situation allowed these people to not think about their own despair, their own whatever, because they were needed, right? One woman who was interviewed, I found an amazing book. It was an oral history of the Blitz. And this woman said, we would have all gone down to the beaches along the Thames. We would have all gone down to the beaches with broken bottles to fight the Germans if we'd had to. Now that's a tight society, right? And it literally improves people's psychiatric issues. 9/11, I live in New York. 9/11 in New York, the suicide rate went down after 9/11. Violent crime rate went down, and Vietnam vets who were suffering from PTSD said that their symptoms were alleviated by the urgency of the moment. They were needed again. And finally, and this is a really important part that I think connects to a Christian ethos very, very well. In a healthy society, there are different levels of responsibility, different levels of seniority, different levels of compensation, unavoidably, no problem there. But there is an egalitarianism, right? No one has extra rights, right? So in the military, you got generals and you got privates, but everyone has equal access to dignity. Everyone has equal access to honor. So the first living Medal of Honor recipient since Vietnam happened to be in the unit that I was embedded with, Sal Junta, right? A private, he was a specialist, I think, but regardless, a specialist who has been given the Medal of Honor, when he's walking through a military base, generals salute him. That's a profound egalitarianism, right? So one of the things that makes for a cohesive society is the sense that we may all be different, we may have different responsibilities, but we are all, on some moral level, we are all the same. And I'm running a little bit running out of time, but I'm gonna finish with a story that sort of exemplifies, I think, this idea that we're all in this together. Like I said, I'm an atheist, but one of the things I really like about Christianity is the idea that we're all in this together. It's an ancient human response to danger and hardship and stress and sorrow. And I really love that about the Christian message, and basically the equality of all people. One earthquake that I studied in Italy, a survivor said, something like 96% of the population was killed in under a minute, and the survivors had to struggle for days before help got there. And one of the survivors said that as soon as it happened, rich, poor, criminal, non-criminal, whatever, noble, none of those social ranks mattered. It just mattered if you were willing to help everyone survive, right? And the survivor wrote later, he said that the earthquake had created what the law promises, but cannot in fact deliver, which is the equality of all people. So I'm just going to very, very quickly tell this story because it's sort of my favorite story about how we can all think like this in this, I think, confusing new age that we're in. I gave a talk at Norfolk Naval Base, and I was at a hotel off post in the morning. I got up early and I was flying out of there, and there was a guy in a wheelchair, an older guy, just a nice looking guy in his 70s, and he's in a wheelchair and his right leg ended at his knee. And it was bandaged. This had happened recently. And he was trying to get into a car in the carport, and I was standing there waiting for my ride, and of course I went over, I said, "Sir, can I help you?" And he said, "No, I'm fine, I just gotta wait for my wife to show up." And he looked down at his knee and he said, this is all new to me. And I said, I wasn't quite sure what to say. I said, "Well, it seems really hard." And he said, "Well, it's interesting." So first of all, notice he wouldn't even allow himself that losing half of his right leg at age 70-something was hard. It was interesting, right? Zero self-pity, right? I'm like, okay, this is going to be a tough nut to crack, right? So I tried again, and I said, "You seem really brave about it." And he looked at me like I was the biggest fool that he'd seen all week. And he said, "Brave about it? Are you kidding? There's young people in this country missing both their legs. Don't tell me I'm brave." Now, he didn't, I don't know if he was a Democrat or Republican. I don't know if he was religious or not, or I don't know anything about him, right? He was white, but none of that mattered. He was talking about people, fellow Americans, and moreover, fellow human beings. And it's like, don't worry about me, I'm good. I'm worried about these people, And I feel like if there's one thing that the church can bring to this country, if there's one thing that respectful, heartfelt dialogue can bring to this country, is that we all figure out how to think like that incredible man. I have no idea who he is. I wish I knew. He went on into his future and into my past, and I wish there was a statue to him somewhere. But for me, that's what we should all be striving for. That 75-year-old guy who just lost his leg. I think I've left enough time to answer a few questions. I'm glad I made it through without a coughing attack. Thank you. It was a real pleasure speaking to you guys. Thank you. Thank you.
Sebastian, thank you so much, man. I'll give you another one of these. Wow. I'm so glad. I think now you understand why we've been trying to make this happen for 2 years. Come on and have a seat, Sebastian. Thank you so much, man. You alluded to something in your talk. It wasn't only your book Tribe that really kind of caught my attention and caught my eye, but you were talking about how those soldiers wanted to go back to Afghanistan. They didn't want to go home. They wanted to go back. And if you ever get the opportunity, you need to you need to make the opportunity. You need to go look up Sebastian's TEDx talk called Why Soldiers Miss War. It is obviously it's a TED talk, so it's not long. Even my attention span could hold for the whole thing. And it is so powerful, but I think it's fascinating. And one of the things that drew me to your work, it was that talk. If you don't mind, just kind of talk a little bit about what it is that draws these guys back to war.
Well, I think it's the experience of living in close proximity with people they love and depending on them and being dependent upon. And the beauty of a modern, safe Western society is that you don't, on a daily basis, generally feel that your life is threatened. I don't think anyone in this room is wondering if they're going to eat tomorrow. Whatever. The sort of basic tasks of survival are answered for us, and a lot of them those tasks are performed mechanically through industry or other people who are hired to do it. I don't know a single person that grows the food that I eat. That's new in human history. That's really new, right? We all drive cars. My sort of lefty friends back during the Iraq War were very fond of the bumper sticker, "No blood for oil," and I finally pointed out, listen, man, that's a bumper sticker. You put it on a car that runs on oil. I can articulate some good reasons for not going into Iraq, but that's not one of them unless you're riding a bike, man. So we're a very disconnected society, and when you're in combat, everything is super connected, and the things that keep you alive, the food, the safety, we basically had babysitters, right? Everyone would go to sleep, and there was two guys pulling guard duty for 2-hour shifts, and then they wake the next guy up. You wake a guy up by grabbing the heel of his foot and saying his last name, and hope he doesn't jump too much. And one of those guys, Steiner, when he went home on leave, he went to sleep the first night back home. He went to sleep in his bedroom, and he asked his mom to wake him up in the morning, and he said, "But listen, Mom, when you come in to wake me up, just do me a favor, just squeeze my heel and say Steiner, right? The mom had to call her own son by his last name because anything else, he didn't know what it would trigger, right?
Wow.
So we're being babysat by these, in 2-hour shifts. I can't tell you how comforting it is. I've camped alone in the woods of New England where nothing's going to kill me, and I barely sleep all night, right? I've been, out at Restrepo, heavy combat situation. I slept like a baby because I was watched over just like when we're children. And there's something about that, I'm being taken care of, and I'm taking care of other people, and there's something about that which is so profound and beautiful. When you're exposed to it, you just want more. It's amazing.
And that was the thing that I was so struck by was, you said it just a second ago, but it was when you think about why would somebody miss war, it's certainly not being shot at, and no healthy person enjoys killing other people, but when you strip it all down, it was love.
Yeah, totally.
It was that love that you developed, even with guys that you didn't necessarily like. Yeah. They were helping keep you alive, so you loved them.
Yeah. Yeah, we were on an ambush at one point, and I was sitting next to a guy named Brendan O'Byrne. I was very good friends with, and I still am. We're very, very close. And ambushes sound exciting, but they're really not. You basically sit all day waiting for something to happen that doesn't happen. And so there's a lot of time to talk. And at one point, Brendan said, it's weird. There's guys in the platoon who straight up hate each other, but we'd all die for each other. And so what happens is when these guys go back, the feeling of security, of being surrounded by people that feel that way about you, is so enormous that you can be in a situation which is factually more safe. In other words, in your suburban home, with your mom, whatever, wherever you go at 19 and 20, whatever you go back to, that's physically safer. But it doesn't feel safe because you got nobody around you. And so what people, and I think it's also true of women who have been in the service, what they keep opting for is a situation of danger where they're surrounded by people that they trust. And that feels good. And can you have it both ways? Can you have that wonderful feeling but no danger? I don't think so. I mean, I hate to say it, like that feeling. You can have love, you can have all kinds of things, but that intense security, I would die for you, like that's a very rare thing, and it happens in situations where that actually might happen. And humans are efficient creatures. Like we don't have feelings like that if we don't need them, because they're very costly. The willingness to die for an unrelated male peer in sort of Darwinian terms is like really stupid, right? I mean, that guy gets to have children, you're dead, right? Like, and so it's a very inefficient, in some ways, unreasonable thought, but it's extremely powerful, and it feels very, very good.
Have you spent any time in Israel?
I was there very, very briefly.
I've gotten to go a couple of times, and one of the things that I've been really struck by is the unity of the Israeli people.
Yeah.
And I think it's probably not all this, but a lot of it is the fact that they are all, male and female, required to serve in the military.
Yeah.
And the last time we were there, one of our tour guides was explaining, when we're in the military together, all of a sudden we're a classless society.
Yeah, right.
Rich is with poor, poor is with rich, and in between and all those kind of things. But it helps us to understand each other, and it creates a shared experience that every single Israeli citizen shares with every other Israeli citizen. Yeah. We don't have that.
No, we don't. And I think one thing that would be quite good for this country, the draft is a very complicated thing. One of the biggest downsides of it is it only happens during wartime. But what do we do that keeps people engaged in this country even when there's no war to fight? And I think mandatory national service in return for a tax credit, or I don't know, what do you need to incentivize it? You got to figure out how to do it, but I think mandatory national service with a military option, because some people are going to want to join the military, they're not going to want to build schools somewhere, whatever. But that experience, just as you said, it mixes everybody up, all different beliefs and races and cultures and America's this amazing, crazy place, right? It's everything, right? Every people in the world, every language, and I live in New York, which is like the end of the funnel, right? I mean, it's like packed onto a 7-mile long island. It is everybody, right? And that to me is one of the most wonderful things about this country, is that we are that. And a national service would, there's some pretty benighted people all across the political spectrum. And one of the reasons they can afford to be like that is they actually don't encounter people who aren't like them. And national service would change that.
I'm sensing out of the Spur Leadership Conference 2019 a Junger Fiorina ticket, or Fiorina Junger candidacy of some sort. I think that would be fascinating. Okay, you were talking earlier about the Native Americans and how they never came to live in white society, but many of the whites who were captured would stay in the Native American cultures that they had been abducted into, and obviously under horrific situation. Was the book you were thinking of The Empire of the Summer Moon?
Yeah, I just blanked on it. Yeah, exactly. The Empire of the Summer Moon. Amazing book.
It is a fascinating book. I'm just going to tell you, it's strong. It's like NC-17 graphic, but it's great. Historically, it's historical. It's not anything inappropriate. It just tells the story of what happened when these two cultures collided, and it was very violent. But I loved what you did in Tribe in kind of explaining what the appeal was of the Native American culture for the whites who had been captured. They didn't want to go back.
They often didn't want to go back, and some would just up and leave and go there, right? And, imagine how hard farming was back in the day, right? It was an agrarian society, right? The native peoples of this continent were foraging hunter-gatherer people, right? The sexual mores were way looser. The religion was much more sort of individualistic. Puritan New England was a pretty rough, theologically speaking, like a pretty rough place, right? Apparently in the 1600s, if a young man was caught talking to a young woman he wasn't related to, he was publicly whipped, right? I mean, there were a lot of reasons to look into the tree line and think, that looks pretty good, right?
Hey, we're not so far removed from Puritan New England that 16-year-old guys aren't 16-year-old guys.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
Right. And
young women, by the way.
Yeah. A lot of women had the same reaction to it. I mean, you could divorce, for example, in Native society. I found this amazing letter from this woman who was abducted and then would go into hiding every time, like, the people came around, the white folks came around looking for her to try to, like, bring her back. And she spent her whole life sort of, like, dodging these patrols from her home community, right? And she finally wrote a letter. I think she was French. I can't quite remember, but it's in my book. And she wrote a letter saying, "I'm freer than any woman in your stupid colonies. Like, I could divorce. I could make. My husband and I are equals." And so there is. I mean, if you ask anthropologists, there's a kind of logic to this. If we all in this room, whatever number of people this is, 60, 70 people, something like that, 100, whatever, if we were in a situation of survival, right? The social inequalities we might bring with us into that situation would very quickly stop being relevant. But all of us would be needed to survive. If we walked out there into the bush, right, and tried to make it in the Austin Hills as hunter-gatherers, we would need everybody to pull that one off, right? And if you need everybody, no one outranks anybody, right? And if you could get up and go, no leadership can actually. They can convince you to do things, but they can't order you to do things. Because like, all right, I'll leave. I don't need you, right? And that's a very, very important thing to remember about our evolutionary past, that they were profound. Anthropologists say that they were profoundly egalitarian societies. And the way to think about it is this, like with a car, which is more important? The brakes or the gas tank, the carburetor or the muffler, whatever. Like, you need all that stuff for it to drive. So you really can't rank the parts of a car. I mean, the signal light maybe, or whatever, but those are major engine components. Like, you can't rank them. You need all of them, and that is humans in a crisis, modern people in a crisis. That is our evolutionary past. That is a lot of tribal society. And so if you come from this very stratified white society of the colonial era, or after the revolution as well, and you go and you enter this tribal society, I'm sure it was totally intoxicating. I mean, clearly it was, because like people kept not coming back, and then great thinkers of the day like Benjamin Franklin were writing these letters, sort of despairing about it, right? Because we were a superior society. We thought we were a superior society. So why? I mean, he literally wrote a letter about like, why is it that we're always our young people are going to live with the Indians, and that that doesn't happen the other way around.
Right.
It really disturbed people.
Well, and I think, too, you mentioned, you talked about how as affluence rises, so do the psychological stressors, anxiety, stress, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. I love what you said, that in a healthy society, leaders heal fractures and create bonds. Good leaders heal fractures and create bonds. Talk a little bit about what you've read, and because you kind of come at this from a very anthropological perspective.
Yeah.
Which I think connects to everything, because it's people.
Yeah.
It's that development. Talk a little bit about how healthy leaders do that and what you've seen in your research.
Well, I think this is really me just speaking as a thinking person, sort of puzzling about it. I haven't researched that specifically, but what I would say is that the core quality of a trustworthy leader is the de Gaulle type, that is where they're not concerned about their own personal outcome. They're concerned about the outcome for the group. And that's a very, very important, that's the only thing, really, spoken in human terms, that's the only kind of person that is deserving of being in a leadership role.
Carly told, I'm sorry to interrupt you, but Carly told a story this morning of a guy who was abusing members of her team. And she realized, she goes, I called him and I said, don't ever do that again.
Yeah.
And we're not doing any more work for you until you apologize.
Yeah.
And she said, then I gathered my team together and said, I'm probably going to get fired, but I want you to know what just happened.
Yeah.
But it's having that courage, it's that moral courage to put your own welfare aside for the good of the group for whom you're responsible.
Right. And it makes total sense. If you think about it in the context of a small group, it makes total sense. A sports team, I mean, no one who is using the basketball game for their own greater glory is doing their team any good, right? I mean, and so it's a very fine balance. I mean, you have these individuals who really excel at things, but when they cross the line into using the group as a vehicle for their own betterment, that's when it gets toxic and dangerous. And so among the Kung of the Kalahari, I mean, the Kalahari is one of the harshest environments in the world. Among the Kung, they will go into periods of drought where, in small groups of, around this size, the hunters will go out day after day, week after week, and fail to kill anything. And the entire group will be starving. And if one guy, all the hunters are men, if one guy bags one big animal, it saves the entire group, right? So imagine the potential for that guy to get an outsized ego, right? He's not just hitting baskets against the high school rival. He's saving everybody's life, right? So what do? They have this ritualistic thing where they, if you take down a big animal, the hunter runs back to camp, grabs everyone before the scavengers can get to the animal, and brings everyone back to help cut it up and carry it, right? These are big animals. And when the village gets there, they make sure to mock him. They make sure to say, you dragged us all the way out here for this thing? Like, it's hungry. It looks hungrier than we are. Like what? Like, and the hunter knows that they're doing that ultimately out of respect. When you create a sort of superhero character, it's dangerous. It's destabilizing to the group. No one needs an ego like that in a small group, right? But it's also unhealthy for the person because it means they're different. It means there's no coming home because they're different. And so I gave a talk. I've talked to the Navy SEALs a couple of times, and I've been asked, like, what do you recommend for transitioning back? And I tell the story about the Kung. I'm like, I know this is a little bit of heresy here, but honestly, if you guys, you all know you're badasses, right? No, you don't need people telling you that. You know it. We know it. You're the top of the food chain, guys. Like, everyone knows that, right? So you can afford to have a little fun, right? And when you come home, if people were saying, you call that fighting? Like, my grandmother could fight that harder than that. Like, are you kidding? Right? That kind of humor, they all laughed, by the way, thank God. But
because then we get into your survival.
Yeah, exactly. But that kind of humor is incredibly psychologically healthy. And one of the things you actually see on sports teams where there's someone who's a heavy scorer, or in a platoon where there's someone who has a sort of outsized role and outsized influence, is this sort of ritualistic humor that takes the guy down. Like, God, couldn't you hit the basket tonight? Meanwhile, the guy scored 40 points, right? Like, there's this ritualistic humor. I actually think the Washington Correspondents' Dinner, Saturday Night Live, all of these ritualistic abuses of powerful people is the way this society has sort of taken that basic, healthy method of dealing with an extremely important person that we really do need, right? And making sure in this funny ritualistic way that they're taken down to a level where it doesn't destabilize the group. I think it's an extremely healthy thing. You can see the vestiges of that in our own society, I think.
Sebastian, I'm glad to hear you say, I've been threatening to do a sermon series for years called You're Not That Special. I think that'd be a great sermon series. I don't think anybody would come to it, but I think it'd be a great sermon series. The real dangerous sermon series would be Your Kids Are Not That Special.
Yeah, right.
That's the one that we really need, but that's like a whole nother deal. I think one of the big takeaways from our day today for all of our speakers and for all of us is no matter how sick you are, no matter how injured you are, you show up and you play with pain. Will y'all join me in thanking Sebastian for being here? Thank you, sir.
Hey, thank you. That was wonderful. Thank you, everybody. Thank you.